Welcome back to Office Hours, where we are answering all of your questions about workplace communication. I am Meghan Dotter, CEO of Portico and author of The Reluctant Presenter. And I am joined by my niece, Ryan Dotter, a communication expert in her own right. And in our first episode, we talked about the big elephant in the room, imposter syndrome and confidence. And at the end of it, we got started on our next topic. So, Ryan, who is the audience member that throws you off the most whenever you have to speak?
My manager. Absolutely. They are the one that I directly report to. And I know that if I can't do a great job, it's a reflection on them. And so, regardless if there's more senior leaders there, but I don't know why it's so difficult when the manager is in the room, why it feels like, my nerves just get shot.
You are not alone. There's plenty of research that shows the audience member that people fear the most is their manager. And we are not talking about a super intimidating, toxic, rough, anything. It can be, you can have the most supportive manager in the world, and you can still feel like, oh boy, this is really intimidating. And part of it is because their opinion matters so much. Not only are they the ones who ultimately decide on your performance review, whether you get promoted, a bump in compensation or bonus. You work with them every day, and so you are interested in getting their feedback. So we're going to talk about some ways to help you become more confident when they are in the room. And the number one thing comes down to how you prepare for those meetings. And I will tell you that if the first time your manager is hearing what you have to say, your position, your idea, when you are in front of others, especially if you're in front of a client, you're setting everyone up to fail. When we talk about workplace communications, it's not just related to presentations, but I will ask Ryan, and you're speaking on behalf of your whole generation. How often have you or your colleagues, when you're preparing a presentation, your way of preparing is for your manager to ask to view your slide deck?
All the time. I mean, I less in my role, but I talk with my friends all the time, and it's asking to walk through it. But sometimes they don't even get that opportunity, and they just get thrust into a meeting. And I think it's it's that nerve wracking. It's like, oh my gosh, I need to do well by my manager and by my team, and by the content that you need to present. And if you can't deliver it well, we've all been in a room where it falls flat, and the only thing that people take away is the delivery, not the content.
Mhm. Yep. And it could be a separate issue of how tethered we are to that PowerPoint and review. But you know, when you're looking at slides or notes or talking points, that is only giving you, I would say, 10% of what's actually going to transpire in the room. And you're reviewing a document that is designed for reading when you actually want to prepare for a conversation. So one thing you can do is to ask your manager and say, hey, do you have 15 minutes? It is very hard for someone to say no to 15 minutes and say, I want to run my opening, my close. I want to run an idea by you before we get into the meeting. And so you getting in front or on Zoom or Teams or whatever and talking about and getting that 15 minutes. Now, ideally that 15 minutes turns into 30 minutes and then you're fully prepared for the meeting. But go and ask at 15 minutes and go in ready to almost rehearse with them or say, can I get your feedback on this idea? And
Mm.
then that's when you're going to get the insight. And I'm going to take you to the perspective of what's going on in your manager's mind. They are going from hot button issue one to the other, and they're getting way more context about what the client is thinking, what the higher ups in the organization are thinking, that they might not have time to debrief you on. And so they're going for this full information and you're dealing with less information. So this asymmetry creates an imbalance already. But when you can say, hey, this is what I think we should lead with because this is what, an agreement we want our client to do, that's when they can say, oh, no, actually, here's what you need to know. Or here's the area that I really want you to land on. And the
Mhm.
beautiful part about this is, again, when you're doing this as a conversation and not in text and not in, talking over PowerPoint slides, you are already rehearsing, and you rehearsing and getting your manager's validation is going to set you up so that instead of being another person in the room who's going to make you feel less confident, you will feel as if they are truly supportive ally. This is not the first time they've heard that.
Mhm. And I think that goes back to the point, and I know we're gonna touch on this later, but kind of the office politics and managing up and making sure you have someone in your corner when you're making those big presentations, and the most obvious choice is your manager, so I'm glad that we're talking about that. But could we talk about, how to manage, especially when you're new in your career and you don't know, maybe it's your first time in office, maybe you're fully remote. How can you navigate the office politics of an organization?
Okay. When I took a leadership development class, gosh, maybe 15, 20 years ago, and we had all these books and articles that we were supposed to read. And one of these sessions was on office politics. And I just had this visceral reaction of like, I don't want to be in office politics. Like, I don't want to be a gossip.
Mhm.
And when you really understand the word politics, you're like, oh no, this is the engine that makes things run. This is how you collaborate in professional services. This is how you get ideas, test ideas, build relationships. And, when it comes down to confidence and managing up, the easy answer is you can build more relationships so that you feel more confident in the room. I worked with a young man who was in a development company, and so they would go develop these beautiful hotels around the world. And he said, I go into these meetings, and he'd been there about 6 months, and I know my presentation, I know my pitch is as good as everyone else's, but I am barely even getting through the first minute and I'm shot down. Like, what is going on? And so I had, call him Jake, give me his presentation. I was like, this is a really good presentation. Like, I don't know what else I would offer to it.
Mhm.
But then I asked Jake, I was like, well, walk me through your workday. Like, how many people do you know in that room? He was like, well, I see them every month when we get together for these project review meetings.
Mhm.
I was like, do you go to coffee with them? Do you have lunch? And he was like, no. He was like, we have twins at home. So now we have 3 children under the age of 5. So when I come to the office, I am all about the business. And I was like, well, Jake, like, I'm going to ask you to just get one coffee a week and see how things change. And so he made a list of all the people on his team and then who was in legal, who was in marketing. And he methodically went through one coffee a week
Mhm.
and opening up and getting to hear about other people's work and talking about your work is a great way to build those relationships. And it comes down to science. There's a professor over at the University of Virginia, Professor Cohen, who studied how when we think we're about to get an electric shock and you do an MRI, like, you automatically will tense up because who wants to get an electric shock? When you observe a stranger who is under that same threat, your brain doesn't react the same way. When you see a friend, because as part of the study, everyone had to come with a friend. When you
Mhm.
see a friend about to get that electric shot, you tense up in the same way as if you're going to get
Wow.
shocked. And so what this tells us is, it gets to the core of like why we are more empathetic, why we are more invested in people we know. So
Mhm.
get to know your colleagues. And if you are virtual, you can do virtual copies. 15 minutes of, hey, would love to learn more about your work. Do you have time?
Could you walk us through the difference between office politics and office gossip?
Okay. Great distinction. I mean, obviously, the office gossip is the juicier stuff. It's the tea. It's like more intriguing, but think long and hard about your brand. And the one way to differentiate what is news that is part of politics, of getting the backstory of why people are making decisions, why certain priorities are changing, is would you be comfortable if anyone else, if that third party were hearing what you've said? And if there's any bit of pause or cringe, then simply back out of it. You do not want to be part of that. And so find some way of gracefully exiting the conversation of, oh my gosh, change it to the weather, change it to something else, change it to um, maybe even say what you like about that person. it is when an organization is going through a difficult time and there's a lot of uncertainty, you will see more of a tendency for office gossip to come up. So find that test of, is this information that if the person were in the room, they would be hurt, be uncomfortable? Office politics is you are building your network within your team, outside of your team. There was a woman on TikTok who was an executive for Nike, and she said the best piece of advice I got was to walk the halls at least once a week. She said some people did it once a day, because if people don't know what you do and the value you provide, there's no way for them to know whether you should be pulled on to the next project, or worse, if those consultants come in and they're trying to cut cost, they're not going to know how to advocate for you. And if it seems like it's too self promotional, if that's like, well, that's not what I do, I work to speak for itself, I have news for you. We are not in school anymore. You do not have a teacher who is looking thoroughly and thoughtfully at your work. You talking about your work is a way of advocating for you, for your team, to learn about other people's perspectives, which in turn is going to make your work so much better.
And I think I saw the similar advice, and I've definitely taken that on in my current role. And even when you get coffee in the morning, doing a walk, or walking a different way back to your desk, and it's a great way I found to talk with interdepartmentally all the different people that are in the office, learn more about their work. And in my role now, I mean, I'm working with them, but they're all seem a little bit siloed. And it's amazing when, crisis comes in and you need help from one of those departments. It's so much easier to call that person knowing that I've had a conversation and then ask for their help, than if I had just called them when I needed them and they had no idea who I was. So I loved that advice, and I have taken that in, and I try to do it as much as possible. And it's a great way to then, everyone knows who you are. And then at the company holiday party, whatever it is, you're not just in your own department's silo. I
Mhm.
found it very valuable in my current role, and I think I love that advice. And I like the advice too for remote workers doing just coffee chats. I know I have a permanent one set up with one of my colleagues, and it's a great way that they can feel connected to the office, but being far away. So
Mhm.
I love
And if
that.
you're struggling about what to talk about, and this is advice for, there are a lot of introverts out there.
Mhm.
Shy people. Go armed with questions. Go prepared with questions like,
Mhm.
why do you do what you do? What do you love about it? What's big for you this week? I know that's a great way of helping. I learned this the hard way. And so I'm once again, I'm glad that you are figuring out this much earlier. I was head of comms at a Fortune 200 company, and it was a very stressful time. It was a financial crisis. I was understaffed. I mean, there's a lot of things going on. And I came in, I was working insane hours, like 70, 80 hours a week on weekends. And I was trying to be as productive as possible. And when I needed information, and as a comms person, you need to draw from people throughout the organization. I would ask for people's information. I would ask them to review like an earnings press release or something, and I wouldn't get back to them. I got to tell you, I developed a reputation, and when I got this feedback, we talked in an earlier episode about what it's like to get stinging feedback of
Mhm.
like, you're coming across as, a bit of a know-it-all. I was like, but that I know nothing. Like I'm asking these people for help. And so it was a very painful and powerful reminder of, let it be rare that the first time you pick up the phone and talk to someone is when you need something. Like
Mhm.
build that relationship. And number two, if you do ask someone for their opinion or for help, circle back with them for two reasons. One, if you don't end up taking their input, and you're not going to be able to say yes to everyone who gives you advice. Tell them why before the meeting or before they see that in print or in an email. Give them a heads up. And number two, let them know how it went. Say, hey, remember when you gave me that information on XYZ?
Mhm.
Here's what we did with it. Thank you so much.
Mhm.
So it's, I think if there's one piece of advice I would have for building your network, it's maybe it's 10, 20% of your time is talking about your work, socializing it. And you're going to think you don't have time to do it, but I promise you, you can't afford not to do that, to have
Mhm.
those coffees and build those relationships.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's great. And, we've kind of touched on this, and it kind of goes back to the office politics and maybe a little bit of gossip. But how do you navigate bigger egos in the office? Or, there's this idea that you need to play the corporate game to kind of get to where you want to go. And is that necessarily true? Are there ways that you can stay authentic to you and your values and still manage up and level up in your career? Or when a lot of those egos are at play and a lot of those, office politics, maybe on the more negative side, do you need to just kind of forfeit to the game and play as, everyone else does to level up?
Those are so hard conversations. And I don't know that colleges, universities prepare you for how important it is for office politics. And so, one of the things to be mindful of when you're interviewing is, yes, you're going to be thinking about, what is this company doing? What is their mission? Do my values align with theirs?
Mhm.
Those are things to think about. But also, when you're going through that process, is to really do a gut check of, do I like this person? Do I feel like there's a good energy? And I know that sounds like completely woo woo, but in every case, people knew that there were red flags in the interview process, whether it was I had to go through 15 interviews, they ghosted me until they came back.
Mhm.
These are all, it's almost like dating. It's like, you knew this was going to happen. There was early, there was early advice on that. That's a separate podcast. We're not going to talk about that. But so be mindful of that in the interview process. And then it's that figuring out of, how do you stay tapped in? You're reading the newsletters, you're having your coffee, you're observing, and doing this check of like, what do I value? Are there leaders who I aspire to, who I would emulate to? And you don't have to ask to be the mentor. I'm not, a big part of that, but you are simply seeing if there are leaders, if there are other people who you aspire to. If you find yourself in a situation where you're being asked to do something that is not aligned with your values, that is potentially not even legal, that's a separate issue. And that I almost think we should bring in an HR expert of, HR is there to advocate on behalf of the company. So in those situations, I would say find someone whom you trust outside of the organization who can give you candid advice and guidance on what to do next. And it's being able to step back. This is why work-life balance is so important. Do something different on the weekends, like turn off at night, do something, get out, exercise, do art, like whatever it is.
Mhm.
Get away from it so you can have that perspective of, are things tense right now, and are people snapping at each other a little bit more abrasive because our share price is falling, we lost a big customer, or is this more of a toxic embedded part of the culture? I think we throw terms like toxic workplace around a little bit too quickly, but I think that says, is the person who's giving me stress friend or foe?
Mhm.
Are they having a bad day? Or do I really think that they're not out for my best interest? And being able to think about these and then plan your next move. Because at the end of the day, if you're finding that you are stressed, you have a stomach ache before every meeting, this isn't the right place for you.
Mhm. Yeah. I love that. It's funny because your body does tell you, like, those red flags. It does give you warning signs, and I think it's really easy. And I know we have a plan to talk about this later, but sometimes when you're in an interview process, it's easy to ignore those when you're desperate for a job and you just need to get in the door, and you just figure, "Oh, I'll figure it out later." But you talk about that gut feeling. It does affect your day to day, and I think if you don't have someone in the office that has your back, it can be very isolating, and it does impact your work eventually.
Mhm.
And I think it's great because it all does go into play. And I think you're so right. The colleges don't really prepare you for this aspect of networking within your business. They tell you how to network for a job, but the network once you get the job is, I think, far more important to be successful in what you do and have that visibility. And kind of off of that, I know, we're in a hybrid work environment, and that visibility can be difficult when you're not in the office every day. And even if you're in the office every day, there might be pressure to, even if you're more productive at home, but you're just like, I need to go and show face. How do you navigate that and balance, being visible, but also being productive?
um, un- Unfortunately, and maybe this has changed, but every bit of research I've found is that people are most productive when they're at physically at the office. I used to do this when I was in New York. I would show up at the office, I had my keypad, and I would just have this relaxation when I saw that like the lights were off. And I had like I was the first person to turn on the coffee. Like that's when I got my work done. Those unfortunately are the most productive times of the day when you are not getting distracted. When someone interrupts you, it takes you 23 minutes to get back to where you were. So this is, I think, a big pushback of like, do not make me go back to the office. I am not going to be as productive. So block your calendar. And maybe it's you're going to be working a little bit on the margins. But if there's thoughtful like work that you cannot be interrupted, do not set yourself up for success and have it in the middle of the workday. When you know that everyone's going to be in the office Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, don't do it then. Do it early morning or Monday, Wednesday, like whatever those are. So find a place where it's realistically going to work for you, and
Mhm.
then set up an accountability partner of like, you know what, we're going to make sure we're going to report back that we had our coffees, we walked the hallway, we showed up for the birthday cake in the break room, and we invested those times that we think are distractions, but at the end of the day, they are so important. And there's one thing I wanted to mention about that, playing the corporate game and reasons why it is so hard early in your career. Maybe if there's a manager who you feel is a little bit more abrasive in their feedback. Um, I have the benefit of being one of those older managers and talking to clients about how to develop younger professionals. And I think there are some cultures, I think the frustration is there's such a pressure to be nice and super supportive, almost to like this toxic positivity of like everything's great. We're only going to talk about great feedback, that some leaders find it difficult to give the type of advice that they know has helped them. I mean, I was interviewing your dad for my book, and he gave me an example. He's like, someone pulled me aside and gave me some tough feedback, and that has always stayed with me. And I'm so grateful for that. And so I hear managers say, I asked someone why they dropped the ball, and the next thing I know, I'm getting a call from HR. And like, I didn't yell. I didn't do it in front of people. It was one, like, I don't know how else to give feedback. And so
Mhm.
I think there's this expectation of know that you're going to screw up and your manager is there to support you. If they're unprofessional about it, if they're mean, if they do it publicly, that is something different. But you're there to grow and to learn. So expect to get some feedback.
Yeah, and that brings up an interesting point, and I know I'm going a bit a tangent, but I'm going to bring it back because we talk about the different generations in the workplace and how, I think at least in my workspace, we hear a lot of how do we handle this new generation that's entering the workforce that, has a hard time having these harder conversations. Kind of was a generation of you get a trophy for everything. And I heard an interesting point of view, and it's from a speaker, and Matt Havens, and he says, we can silo ourselves into all these different generations, but at the end of the day, you're either old or you're young. And it's been that way in the office, forever. And it's every time you have this clash, and it's, it goes back forever. And there's a misunderstanding because your generation didn't go through what my generation did. And I don't know where you're coming from, but we all have these parts of our generations that we've collectively gone through. And so I think if you just come from an open conversation and have open communication, and maybe that's more a modern thing, I don't know what it was like, but it was an interesting take that we're so quick to silo ourselves like, oh well, I'm Gen Z and this is how I like my feedback, but it's really personal. Like, if I'm not doing a great job, I want that feedback. I want it privately, I don't want it in front of
Right.
everybody, but I do want that feedback. And I think most people, and I don't want to speak for an entire generation because again, I think it changes, but it's like it does depend on the person, and I think it's dangerous when you start to put like generation and you kind of pit each other against one another because I think if you just have a conversation, it breaks down those walls and it's a lot easier to kind of understand where they're coming from and, feedback.
It's funny 'cause as you're talking, I was thinking like, how did we handle, my manager just had a word with me, or just like I got some feedback, or like, oh my gosh, I think I said the wrong thing. Like, and back in the day, we were all in person. And
Mhm.
so you would have this like moment, but then you'd leave the conference room or you go to happy hour and you'd be like, oh my gosh, here's what happened to me today. And then you hear someone's like, oh, that happens to me all the time. Like, blah, blah, blah. That is what Bob does, or that's what Jane does.
Mhm.
Um, and so there was this constant, like, there's like immediate support that would envelop you, or your manager would then shift to say, like, hey, like, did you see we've got extra tickets to the, whatever, or do you want to grab lunch? And so it diffused the moment. Now, that's, in office before pandemic, our generation, like, you knew that you're inevitably going to get some feedback or have an
Mhm.
awkward moment or say the wrong thing at work. Go to today and you're on Zoom and you say something and maybe there's no one's reacting, or you just have this like super awkward moment, or you get some feedback that feels that stings a little. So then you go back and you're like, oh, and you just sit with it
Mhm.
and you perseverate and it just goes on loop in your head over and over again. Or maybe you talk to your roommate and your roommate's like, oh my gosh, that's terrible, you shouldn't have to put up with that, blah blah blah. And so it just kind of gets this life of its own, which gets us back to the show up. Like, or if you're hybrid and you have an awkward moment, like, hop on Slack and be like, was that as bad as I think it was? Or, just simply get that, support and
Mhm.
socialize it with someone who was in the room. You're never going to be able to replicate it perfectly,
Mhm.
but that I think is a big difference generationally of how we handled it. You automatically had a support team, and now you don't because you're all on Teams and Zoom.
Mhm. Yeah. And I do like I'm mostly in person and I'm lucky to have that. And it's great because I do think and the personality that I am, I can only imagine like being on a Zoom and getting that negative feedback and then just sitting there. I just feel like my like productivity and you would just again it kind of goes back to that feeling of imposter syndrome. It's like, oh my gosh, I like
Here's
tomorrow
evidence.
I'm gonna get an
I
email.
just screwed up. Yes.
Right, like, I'm gonna get an email, it's like, "Put some time on your calendar," and I'm gonna be like, it's just it is a really tough scenario, and I think it's, learning to navigate it, and I like the idea of messaging someone or even calling somebody after that meeting and being like, "Can I just vent
Right.
for a second?" Like, I think it's funny, like, I know I saw someone did they have, like, a 5-minute grace period between meetings, and they'll just call someone else in the organization that they can trust, and they can just say, "Hey, that was tough," or, "Before I give a presentation, let's put time so I can debrief with you, excuse me, and see
Mhm.
how it goes." And I think it's a great way to still have that connection and kind of be a player in I say player, but, like, be a part of that community when you're you could be across country, you could be international, like, nowadays everyone's so spread out.
Mhm. Absolutely. That's how we make it work. All right, let's wrap this out with, what's your one takeaway? What was most valuable? What's your piece of advice when it comes to managing up and
Yeah,
building
I
a
think
network?
having those conversations, and, I think everything I say always goes back to communication, but just talking with people, sharing a little bit about your personal life, what you're interested in, I think it can go a long way, and I think if I would have any, like, actionable items, it would be to walk around the office, even set up routine coffee chats if you're hybrid or you're virtual, and I think that's a great way to meet your team.
Mhm. I second that, and I would say make the ask, whether it's 15 minutes a month, if everyone has 15 minutes a month, ideally 15 minutes a week. And, if you make an overture, if you ask someone to hop on Zoom or to get coffee and they say, "No, I'm too busy," like, you tried. And you know what? It does nothing to diminish your brand and your relationship for having made an effort. So, you might get a rejection, but chances are you're gonna make a new friend.
I love that.
All right.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much. Take care.